Welcome back to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. Today we talk to Dr. Kerri Boutelle on food reactivity and targeting appetitive traits. Kerri describes herself as a clinical psychologist attempting to be a neuropsychologist and neuroscientist, developing novel treatments for overeating, binge eating, and obesity. Dr. Boutelle is a professor of pediatrics and psychiatry at UC San Diego and is affiliated with Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego and is a licensed clinical psychologist. She has specialized in studying and treating weight management and eating disorders since 1992 and has been consistently funded by NIH since 2002. Dr. Boutelle has an undergraduate degree in food science and nutrition from Rutgers University and a PhD in health psychology from Illinois Institute of Technology. She completed her clinical internship at the University of Mississippi Medical Center and her postdoctoral fellowship in epidemiology at the University of Minnesota. The focus of Dr. Boutelle's academic investigations is to target overeating in children, adolescents, and adults who are overweight and/or have binge eating. To accomplish this, her work bridges clinical psychology, parenting skills, neuroscience, cognitive science, and behavioral therapy. Dr. Boutelle's research has two goals. One, to identify targets for behavioral treatment of overeating and obesity, and to translate these programs to the clinics, and two, to develop novel targets for the treatment of overeating and obesity based on cognitive science and neuroscience. Dr. Boutelle is the Senior Supervising Psychology at UCSD Eating Disorder and Treatment Program. She's a certified therapist, supervisor, and trainer for family-based therapy for the treatment of eating disorders in youth. She is a clinical specialist who works with families and individuals struggling with binge eating disorders, weight management, anorexia, bulimia, EDNOs, and other gastroenterological problems. Dr. Boutelle loves cycling and yoga and has 3 teenagers, 2 dogs, and a cat, and aspires to be a yoga teacher. Please don't forget to share this episode, subscribe to Alimentos y Emociones podcast, leave a comment, and press the notification button. Help us grow this channel. Also remember that on Spotify you can now leave us some stars and a review, and this helps us to position the podcast in a way as to be able to disseminate science and help us grow our community. You can do this by entering the Alimentos Emociones podcast profile on Spotify. Next to the bell you will find 3 vertical dots where it says rate this program. Rate us and help us grow. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. I am very honored today to have with us Kerri Boutelle. Welcome, Kerri.
Thank you, Claudia.
It really is an honor because, your work is very, very close to my heart. And, I have spent a lot of hours studying food cues. And so we're going to talk about food cue reactivity and targeting appetitive traits, which is, your most recent work and the work you've been working on for a few years now.
Decades.
But let's start from like the beginning. How did you get here? How did you get to be involved in this area?
So I actually have an undergraduate degree in food science and nutrition. And during my training, I worked for Kraft and Lipton and Nabisco. And then after graduation, I worked for a big corporation, unnamed, and decided that I didn't want to make better cheese for the rest of my life. So I went back to grad school, and in fact, my advisor did diabetes work. And so it was in grad school that I started working with individuals with obesity, binge eating, and other eating disorders. And so I treat patients across the spectrum, but my research isn't specifically in weight loss and binge eating.
Yeah.
So I did my postdoc at University of Minnesota, where I worked with Bob Jeffrey and Diane Newmark Steiner and other
Wonderful.
very well published, wonderful people.
Yeah.
And then I came to UCSD in 2007. I had to think about that.
So you've been sort of there for quite a while now, and you've been doing all sorts of work. So tell us kind of like where this has taken you, you know, since, because do you still work with eating disorders or not?
Yeah, I do. I'm actually a family-based therapy for adolescent eating disorders. I'm a certified therapist, supervisor, and trainer. So I train people all over the world in the treatment of anorexia, and I'm happy to see those patients in my clinical practice. It's just my work is specifically around trying to reduce overeating or binge eating.
Yeah, which is very specific, and that's probably why you do all this work on food cue reactivity. Yeah.
So I can tell you the story about how the idea came about.
Yeah.
So when I was at University of Minnesota, we were running a trial doing also what's called family-based therapy for children with overweight and obesity. And so it's a parent-child based treatment. Parents and kids come in, they go to separate groups, and then they do what's called behavioral coaching. And in short, there was a kid in the study who was very food cue sensitive. And I didn't even know that that's what it was at the time. This is probably early 2000s. And she said things like, Mom, what are we going to have for snack? What are we going to have for snack? What are we going to have for dinner? What can I have after dinner? You know, and she just thought about food. And in fact, now I would call it rumination about food all day. You know, her entire day was spent thinking about food. And so the parent followed as much as she could our recommendations about reducing calories and increasing physical activity, but it was almost impossible with a kid like that. And then also the parent-child relationship was really strained. And so over the years, we started seeing a number of these kids. And if you ever meet one or an adult, you'll notice things like if there are potato chips on the table next to you, it'll catch their attention. Yeah. And so we started to think there's people that are specifically sensitive to these food cues, and went down the road of talking to people. And ultimately it was Nancy Zucker from Duke and I who sat in a waiting room and sat there and just talked about what options there might be. And we came up with our first study, which was with kids, where we tested appetite awareness training and what we called at that time cue exposure treatment. So we looked specifically for kids that were high on food cues. So they were high on that eating in the absence of hunger measure, you know, the lab-based measure.
Yep.
And we treated them with appetite awareness training, which came from Linda Craighead's work, who I also really admire. And then we had to ultimately develop the cue exposure treatment, where we did exposures training kids to resist food that's in front of them. Yeah. So we did our first trial, and our first trial showed that kids in the appetite awareness training actually increased weight over time, even though they had done this short, it was an 8-week treatment. Yeah. But the cue exposure kids actually decreased what they ate post-treatment in that EAH paradigm, but then they also stabilized their weight. So we thought, oh, we might be onto something. But the kids, the parents in the cue exposure treatment just didn't know, they didn't understand it, because the kids were pretty smart and they said, oh, Mom, I'm actually hungry. You know, so we never want to teach a child not to eat if they're actually physically hungry. Yeah. But it takes an 8 to 12-year-old a minute to figure out that if they say they're hungry, they're going to get what they want, whether or not they're physically hungry. So we actually,
they learn the difference between sort of like hunger and craving, but they suss out that that's what you're training them to do. And they just say, okay, I'm hungry.
I actually tested it on my own daughter. And so I gave her, she was like 8 at the time. And I gave her like a 1 to 5 scale and said, 1 is like, you're super starving. 5 is you're full. Like, where are you at when you're asking for the snack? She'd be like 1. It didn't matter what it was. So, but it also shows how challenging it is working with kids that don't have necessarily the same motivation that adults do. So we combined the appetite awareness training and the cue exposure treatment into what we're now calling ROC, regulation of cues, which is what we just published in JAMA with adults. Yeah. So we did our first trial with regulation of cues with kids, and we did a 4-month intervention. This was still at University of Minnesota with my colleague, Carol Peterson, who also does eating disorder work. She and I did a 4-month treatment with the ROC intervention with kids, 8 to 12-year-old kids, again, high on eating in the absence of hunger. And then we compared it to a control group. And you and I were briefly talking before about having trouble publishing things.
Yeah.
This was my hardest one, because it's when you do these small studies, the kids in the control group lost weight. And
Yeah.
it's like, and so our group lost weight, but so did those kids. So we ended up with very few findings.
So is this just, do you think that because you're in a sort of intervention setting, and so basically just people try harder, would it be different if you were like just, you know, privately working with them?
Well,
I'm just curious. Because I think the whole intervention setup is very different, you know, to, you know, just in private consult.
Totally true. And if you think about it, they come in expecting something. Now, the kids in our control group were randomized to nothing, and they just got the book at the end. So I can't even hang my hat on that. But kids grow at different rates. So when you use BMI or standardized BMI or BMI percentile or any of those outcomes, if the kids grow a bunch during that period of time, then it ends up reducing. Also, I mean, the other thing that happens is that there's a lot of variability in weight loss studies. People think, oh, I'm going to lose 5 pounds because the average is 5 pounds. No, it's the average. So a lot of people lose 20 and some gain 5.
Yeah.
You know, so when you have these small samples, like 20 and 20 in each arm, it's really, the variability really can impact all of the outcomes.
Yeah.
So, but I tried to sell that paper on feasibility and acceptability, because that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
But we had a hard time getting it published, and luckily, knock on wood, we were able to get it published.
Yeah.
But I started to think at that time, you know, am I going down the wrong rabbit hole? You know, am I going to spend the rest of my career trying this and not getting anywhere?
Yeah.
So then we decided to work with adults, because adults can often tell you more about what's happening. And they might be engaged more. So we did a pilot trial, a one-arm pilot trial, Claudia, with adults with overweight and obesity and binge eating.
Yeah.
And so in that study also, we showed that the adults lost weight, and they reduced their binge eating, and they reduced their food cue reactivity at that point.
Yeah. And that was that was giving them what, intervention on food cue reactivity, or what were you giving them?
So we gave them the ROC intervention, and I didn't explain this earlier, but the intervention is about, depending on how long the treatment is, it's about half of it is spent on appetite awareness training, where you train people to sense and stop eating when they're, you know, we use a 1 to 5 scale. Some people use 1 to 10, but 5 is totally stuffed, 1 is starving, and you teach people to eat when they're a 2 or 3 and stop when they're a 3 or a 4. Yeah. You know, and you really focus. We do exercises around sensing appetite. We do breathing exercises to try to get people to sense how full their stomach is. So that's the first part.
So is it a sort of, sorry, I'm just going to keep on asking you all these questions. So does it does that include sort of like some mindfulness stuff, or all this talk about mindfulness, when you think, you know, okay, well, I'm teaching them how to breathe, I'm teaching them to be aware. Would you say that? Would you not?
So deep breathing and sensing your body is part of a number of different interventions.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we don't teach mindfulness per se. We definitely don't teach mindful eating.
Okay.
That's different than mindfulness.
Yeah.
We don't teach people to focus on the food and where it came from and all of those things that are part of mindful eating.
Yeah.
And to slow their eating down. We just teach them to try to sense their stomach.
Yeah. Okay.
And now, years later, knowing some of the some of the animal research, I now think that truthfully, some people it's broken. And we can talk about that later. But so the first part about ROC is that type of intervention. We actually have adults and kids actually bring in meals, and we coach them on eating the meals and sensing their hunger, beginning, middle, and end. The thing about ROC is that there is no diet. We don't tell people to cut back what they're eating. We try to get them to stop based on hunger. Yeah. And then the second part of the intervention is the exposure part, where we have people bring in their highly craved foods, and they rank their cravings, you know, again, on a 1 to 5 scale. And they hold, smell, and take a small taste of the food and put it down. And they do this for 2 minutes with each food. And then they put the food away and they get another food out. And the original idea was to extinguish the craving response. So cravings go up and they always come down, and you use the habituation graph, that ultimately your cravings will go down. Now, in light of Michelle Krask's work and Jonathan Abramowitz, we now think about it as inhibitory learning. Right. So the old learning exists below. So the cravings are still there. It's just the individual learns to inhibit it. So Mark Boughton would say, you lay new learning on top of old learning, but the old learning can always reemerge. So we're now working on strengthening inhibitory learning in some of our trials.
Yep.
But I've taken most of what we do now in exposure therapy from those two researchers, Krask and Abramowitz. They have some really, really nice papers that map out all the different ways to strengthen inhibitory learning. So we use a number of them, but the second half of the ROC treatment are all these exposure treatments. And throughout, we're teaching people psychoeducation about what food cue reactivity is, how it develops, the neurobiological triggers, as well as some of the memory and learning issues that come up along with this food cue reactivity. And ultimately, the model gives people permission to have it, and to fail, because it's really challenging in some people to resist foods when it's in front of them. And so our targets are always eating when you're not physically hungry. We don't tell people to diet. We don't tell people to get hungry. We try to target eating when you're not physically hungry. So it was that trial, the adult trial, that triggered the one we just published in JAMA.
Right. Would you like to talk about that, or do you want to go back to what you were going to talk about, the neurobiological sort of more pathways and the effect of why, the triggers, are so difficult to override?
Well, I'll tell you my interpretation of the literature, which is how we translate it to people in our clinic. So through Terry Davidson and Scott Konoski's work, we've learned that saturated fat can permeate the blood-brain barrier and can impact the hippocampus, which is part of the satiety network, as well as affects memory. So there is a large body of experimental work on memory as well, which I can talk about. But ultimately, the way I explain it to participants is that our own data showed that kids with obesity have smaller hippocampi compared to kids who are healthy weight, and have certain nodes that are overactivated by food cues compared to kids that are healthy weight. In fact, we're doing a neuroimaging study right now looking at healthy weight kids and food cues and ultimately weight gain over time. So
I've spoken to Susan Carnell. And before on the podcast, I'll also put a link so those interested in that sort of work, the neuroimaging work and appetite, can sort of link onto that as well.
She does some really fabulous work, as does Kyle Berger at UNC. He's another one that's worked in this area in terms of food cue reactivity and learning.
Great. Okay,
so we have it. So we're trying to pull apart. Go ahead.
No, you go.
No, there was a gap. I didn't hear you, and then it came back.
No, so you focus on, on actually trying to explain the effect on the hippocampus to the participants.
Exactly. Because they need to know that their biology was set up this way. We also talk about the behavioral susceptibility theory, as you know, Susan Carnell and Jane Wardle, and Claire Llewellyn has done a good amount of genetic work, supporting the theory, which is this idea that kids are born with certain appetitive traits right from the beginning, and they interact with the environment to produce, food cue reactivity, changes in appetite, all those different things, which explains why in some families there are kids that are able to stay healthy weight while other kids gain weight over time.
Exactly. And you see the avidity. So going back to what you were talking about before, you see the avidity in these children who just want to carry on eating. Actually, you see it from the very, very early age at the, breastfeeding or milk, feeding stage. So from 0 to 6 months, then they're born with these traits, and you can see the difference. And we've been doing work with that and with Claire as well. So if you see, right now we're relating the responses to cues that mothers have with the children as well. So if the mother can recognize as well that she has certain traits and these reactions to food, like, you know, this food reactivity or the inability to respond to your satiety cues as well, then, and the child is like that, if you kind of are more aware, then maybe you can help your child as well. But, you know,
that's a great idea.
Yeah, and become more aware that the child has this, and not just, you know, feed the child all the time.
Which later turns into a lot of blame for the kids too.
Yep, and the mother.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a double, you know, it's a really double-edged sword. So
exactly.
Wow.
So individuals, at least our adults, like to hear about this. They like to understand, you know, some of the neurobiological reactivity. We can talk about insulin responses. We're now doing, as I said, some interventions around memory, which in about 10 years, maybe we can talk about and see where it goes to. But we talk to them about the neurobiological pieces. We talk to them about the behavioral susceptibility theory. And then we use language talking about how the environment is tricking them into overeating past nutritional needs.
That I think that's an interesting component, because with, you know, with our work, well, the work that I did, we didn't quite get there, but it was just, you know, like we were talking about earlier, an acceptability study. But I'll link on to that later. Right. Can we hear all about your JAMA study right now, and all this, you know, reactivity, food reactivity, and the measurement, you know, the relationships of targeting these traits, again, on patients with BMI. How did you carry this out? Because that was a long study as well to be able to get done.
It was 271 adults who had overweight or obesity. And I want to note that we didn't specifically select people who were high on food cue reactivity for that study. We just took all comers and we randomized them to one of four arms, right? One is regular behavioral weight loss. Two was our ROC program that I just talked to you about. Three was ROC with, we call it combined with behavioral weight loss, but it included counting calories and trying to restrict calories. And then the fourth was an attentional control, and the attentional control was mindfulness, social support, and nutrition education.
Yeah, that's why I was asking you as well earlier on if, you know, you had if mindfulness was part of your ROC study or not, just from, you know, looking at that control group in the study.
Mm-hmm. So mindfulness was part of the control group, but again, it was blended with nutrition and social support. And honestly, people loved it. We had the highest retention in the attentional control. I mean, it wasn't significantly different, but it was pretty high retention, and people really liked it. Even though they didn't lose a lot of weight, they felt better, which I think in and of itself is a good outcome. But they really didn't lose much weight. In fact, they gained weight over time in the attentional control. It was so. We did intervention.
But when you compare it, it wasn't the one that had the best results, was it?
No. Yeah. So the outcomes were, we did 6 months worth of treatment, and then we did 6 months worth of boosters, I would call it. So ultimately in the literature right now, if you look at behavioral weight loss interventions, they're suggesting a year. The year was really hard for people to stick with. They get tired. And once we reduced the frequency, our attendance went down. So our interventions now are sticking to 6 months. But in this study, we did 6 months worth of, it was weekly for 4 weeks, biweekly for 2 weeks, and then monthly for the next 6 months. And again, as I said, we did ROC, what we call ROC plus, that's ROC plus nutrition, energy restriction, and then behavioral weight loss, and then attentional control. And what we found was that anything that includes dietary restriction, people lose weight during the first 6 months more than potentially the other arms. So our ROC intervention didn't necessarily lose as much weight at 6 months post-treatment, but the interesting outcome was that as soon as treatment frequency reduced, the two arms that included energy restriction, they bounced right back up. We saw that V that we see in behavioral weight loss. Every single study, you see this V where people lose weight when they're in the treatment and they gain weight back. So we saw that. And what was interesting for us was that the rock group actually, they all ended up at the same spot at the follow-up treatment at the 24-month period. But the rock group continued to lose weight after treatment.
Yeah.
So they didn't necessarily lose as much at 6 months, but they ended up in the same spot and they didn't have that V, which has a number of psychological implications, as you can imagine, that people feel like they can't do it and they quit trying and all those kinds of things. So it's the first treatment that I know of that continues to show even a small amount of weight loss after treatment ends. Yeah. So that was the first interesting part about our study. The second interesting part was we created a scale actually for food cue reactivity, which it essentially includes, it was compiled by all the different measures that exist right now. And it includes three questions on uncontrolled eating, like feeling like you can't stop, that kind of stuff. And then it includes 3 questions on food rumination. That's what I call it. Like food is on my mind all the time. I can't stop thinking about food, those kinds of things. And it seems like those 2 things together. So we called it the food cue reactivity scale. The scale development paper is under review right now. Hopefully it'll get published. But when we look at individuals that were high on that scale, individuals who are high on this food cue reactivity scale did better in the ROC and the ROC plus arms than they did in behavioral weight loss. So that shows that targeting these appetitive traits, targeting these specific appetitive traits for people that are high on these types of traits ultimately seem to work better than telling them to stop counting calories and exercise more.
So that's what I did in my PhD for the acceptability paper, which is like, you get a group of people and then you measure their traits. And then once you've got their traits measured, then you just target those traits specifically to those. And then doing qualitative work with people, you ask them, how they feel about actually getting behavioral advice that is just very targeted to, having high food reactivity or having low satiety responsiveness or slow eating or, emotional overeating. That's also included as well. So, it's very specific. Obviously, it was not the trial that you've done, and it is amazing work. And just to see this, to see how like you say, the psychological implications of not watching, the whole sort of thing, show up, and the frustration after you've worked so hard at trying to lose weight and then, gaining it all back again. That's really good. I will actually, obviously, I'll put a link to the paper here, but I do love the infographic that you made for, just for the paper, which is just very useful. Yeah. I will use that, to just show some of the results.
We also published another paper looking in kids in behavioral weight loss, what's called family-based therapy, which we found kids that were high in food cue responsiveness, kids that were high in emotional eating, and kids that were high in satiety responsiveness. They all had overweight or obesity in our study. Yeah. And ultimately, the kids that were high on food cue responsiveness and emotional eating, they had that V as part of, behavioral weight loss, cutting calories, exercising more. And the kids that were high in satiety responsiveness lost weight and kept it off. Yeah. So I'm now convinced that teaching people to learn to resist overeating, so teaching them to inhibit their urges and trying to enhance the satiety responsiveness, those 2 things potentially could enhance weight loss outcomes over time.
I think that's really interesting. You're looking at it like as well from a really psychological point of view, but there's this massive, you have the dietary background. There is this, big anti sort of diet, anti-inhibition, anti-stop, diets don't work. You have to sort of, stop doing diets, that's why all the mindful eating comes in and stuff. But when you understand the psychology behind it, you can't just go and tell everybody that they shouldn't go on a diet because, they don't work. And that is why I love all the behavioral susceptibility theory and, the traits, and looking at that part. The psychology has just really enriches it, because yes, you do have to learn to exert a certain amount of control over the way that you eat in order to sort of self-regulate your weight. I'm not talking about dieting all the time. I'm talking, like you just said, inhibit your or control, what would be the right. I don't know how you feel about that. Well, obviously you've done all this work on this, but it's just really difficult. I see it from the dietetic part, and right now all I can see is just, don't diet, don't diet, don't diet. I hate diets. I hate, calories and counting things. And, I really dislike all that part of nutrition. But so I do love this, response to cues.
Well, if you think about it, diets are, the way that we think about it is diets are external management of overeating, and we're trying to teach internal management strategies, which ultimately, if you talk to people that gain weight efficiently, is the way I would say, they would love to be able to manage it. They would love to be able to eat half of what's on their plate and not finish the rest, but they have years of learning to overeat. And there are these neurobiological factors that drive them to overeating. And they have the psychological aspect, which is, I can't stop eating. Yeah. So I think everybody who says diets don't work are probably correct, on average. Now, there are people that it definitely works for. Here we're talking about individual differences as well. There are definitely people who can count calories, run with it, and lose weight and are able to maintain it off, right? But on average, most people bounce back. And so we're trying to come up with treatments for those people that don't respond to that treatment. I also treat binge eating.
Yeah.
And so the gold standard models for binge eating disorder are cognitive behavioral therapy. And part of what is a message in that model is, don't work on your weight, just work on your binge eating. And for some of our patients, that's really challenging to tell them that at the beginning, and they feel very invalidated. For some patients, they feel really freed by that comment. And for other patients, they feel really invalidated. But it's challenging to treat someone for binge eating disorder and then say, well, you have to live with all the other comorbidities that come with overweight and obesity. Yeah. So we're trying to treat both. And actually, we have a study funded by the DoD where we're treating veterans with binge eating in our ROC program versus cognitive behavioral therapy. And I have not been able to look at the data because the trial's not done yet, but knock on wood, we're going to hope that it works as well, if not better than CBT, but we're targeting both weight and binge eating versus just binge eating.
Wow. I'd really like to see that paper soon.
Me too.
Kerri, this is amazing work. Really, really amazing work. Well done. Well, it's so interesting to see, someone who has just, say, I'm not moving from this line of work. I will continue, I believe in this. And I think you're a true example of this.
Well, it also could have been 15 years of my career that went down the drain. So I'm glad that it turned out, with these intervention studies, they all come with usually decent theory behind them. It's just tricky. Even mindfulness is another one. Like, the theory makes sense, but in real life, it doesn't result in a lot of weight loss in and of itself.
Yeah.
So there's other things that are getting in the way that we're not targeting.
But you're starting to look at other stuff, the inhibitory learning, the memory, and just the in and of itself, the cues, plus the whole neurobiological side to it, the saturated fats, the appetite circuits, etc. Mm-hmm. So I think it's fairly backed up by, plus the behavioral susceptibility theory, which has a huge backup as well. So it's quite solid.
I struggle with studies that just try to do different versions of eating less and exercising more and counting calories, because it hasn't worked for so long. Like, as psychologists, if I were to say anything, it would be, we need to really think outside the box and stop doing same old in different versions, but try to do some other kind of more novel interventions.
Yeah. Well, I hope that this interview actually gets people sort of, stoked to sort of want to, think out of the box and do different interventions and work on different, subjects. This is great. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kerri, so much. Is there anything else you think that we might want to add to this? I mean, everybody, please read this paper. It's seminal. It's amazing. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your work.
Thank you so much. It makes me feel like all of these years have been worth it when you speak this way.
No, I mean, honestly, well, like I say, it's very close to my heart, but it is also just a really, really important piece of work. And I think that, thank you for doing it. And thank you for leading the way and, for helping us, to help us mentor us as well, which is, what we're always looking for, to aspire to be and to carry on doing stuff and work this way. So I really thank you for that.
Thank you, Claudia.
And I will leave your Twitter account as well, so that people can get in touch with you and obviously, just be able to, repost this work. And if for anyone who is interested as well I'll leave the links to your papers, and please, leave messages, like the program and everything, just so that more people get to see Kerri or listen to Kerri, not just read the paper, which I always think this makes it a bit more human.
It really does. Thank you.
It's really nice to be able to discuss this with you, Kerri, and thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thanks, Claudia.
So everyone, we shall see you next episode, and please remember to again like the podcast, and we shall see you soon next time. And remember, we will always continue to nourish each other. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Gracias por escuchar un episodio más de Alimentos y Emociones Podcast. No olvides dejar un comentario, suscribirte al canal y presionar el botón de notificaciones. Ayúdanos a crecer. Y recuerda, nos seguimos nutriendo.